Vanakkam. Today we are going to see another part of peer review, that is with reference to compliance with technical, professional and ethical standard for practicing unit. And as there are so many parts, I am going to have discussion with the first part. And this is a very interesting thing and important thing. This technical, professional, ethical standards compliance has been divided into four parts. One is accounting standards, standards issued by ICA, frameworks issued by ICA, applicable provisions of various statutes and or regulations. This we will discuss in detail and later part of the presentation. Now, today, we are going to have discussion on standards on accounting. That is SA, standards on accounting. This is a very important area. Every chartered accountant should know what are all the standards on auditing. Standards on auditing. It's not standards on accounting, it is standards on auditing. SA 200, that is overall objectives of the independent auditor and the conduct of an audit in accordance with these standards on auditing. The reviewer has to check what are the important points that the practice unit has to carry out or has carried out. The reviewer should identify whether the practice unit has conducted the audit as per the standards on auditing. So that means it is an expected thing from the peer review board that the practicing unit has to conduct the audit as per the standards on auditing. The reviewer should identify whether the auditor has exercised personal and it is not personal, it is professional judgment and maintained professional skepticism throughout the planning and performance of the audit. So professional judgment they are expecting. So whether the audit is being conducted as per the standards on audit and whether the auditor has carried out the professional judgment correctly, and it has to be, both the things have to be reviewed by the reviewer, that is peer reviewer. Next to standards on auditing is SA 210, that is agreeing the terms of audit engagement. That is first thing, any audit has to be allotted and there should be an engagement letter, and in that engagement letter what are the works that they have to carry out and what about the fees and whether those fees are reasonable or not. Everything has to be checked by the reviewer in his work. The reviewer should review the engagement letter and check whether the scope and roles of responsibilities have been clearly brought out. Then the reviewer should verify whether the fees quoted in engagement letter is reasonable. That means it is indirectly our ICA through peer review board, they say that the chartered accountant should not quote high fees. So fees quoted should be reasonable. And SA 220, that is with reference to quality control for an audit of financial statements. So they expect the audited financial statement should be a quality one. So what are the quality controls that are required to be implemented for the verification of audit of financial statements? The reviewer should assess at the firm level and at the engagement level the quality control as required by this standard. So it is the duty of the reviewer, they have to assess. He has to assess. Then the reviewer should assess the leadership responsibilities for quality on audits, whether the practice unit follows relevant ethical requirements, whether the practice unit follows acceptance and continuance of client relationship. So who is the leader? That is, who is which partner or practicing unit they are going to lead the audit, and whether those audits are have got the quality on audits or not. Then the reviewer should also assess whether the engagement performance is being monitored. So after that is after the appointment as auditor, the work has to be monitored. So these are three things that one chartered accountant in the practice unit they have to carry. But as a reviewer, he has to review all these three things. Now SA 230, that is with reference to audit documentation. The reviewer should review the working papers. So here it is a direct or indirect thing that all the practice units should maintain the proper working papers, and they should have got all the details in the working papers. Suppose if anything goes wrong in future and if any reference is required, everything has to be taken only from the working papers. So it is an indirect indication or direct indication to the practice unit that they have to maintain the working papers, and all those working papers of the practice unit has to establish compliance by the practice unit with the technical, professional, and ethical standards, and to evaluate the work done and conclusions reached. Then the reviewer needs to verify whether the working papers are maintained as per the period as specified in SQC 1 read with SA 230. So that means during the peer review period, whether proper working papers have been maintained by the practicing unit or not, that has to be reported. That has to be reviewed by the reviewer. Then the reviewer should ensure that the firm has adequate policies and procedures to ensure compliance of SCR 230 in respect of assembly of file. So not only the working papers, they should have been properly filed, and whether there are sequence of file numbers or not, everything has to be reviewed and ensured by the reviewer. The reviewer should verify whether the permanent files contains all the relevant information and whether the same is updated regularly to reflect the changes in the information contained in the file. It is a clear indication that the practice unit has to maintain the permanent file of the client, and if there is any updation, whether there is any change in partnership, change in constitution, or whether there any change in profit sharing ratio, or added if there is any change in shareholding pattern, everything should be updated in the permanent file. And the reviewer is also concerned with verifying that the procedures used by the practice units generate sufficient appropriate evidence to support the conclusions arrived at in relation to assurance engagement being reviewed. So it is once again the reviewer has to verify the procedures used. So that this is a very, very important thing, and that to SA 230 is very, very important. It is also related to the working papers, maintenance of permanent file, and updation of the permanent file. SA 240, the auditor's responsibilities relating to fraud in an audit of financial statements. So again, 240 is SA 240, that is standards on auditing. It is related to fraud. That if there is any fraud that has taken place in the concern, whether the same has been identified by the charter accountant of the practicing unit, and whether they have been identified in the audit of financial statement. What are the important things? That the reviewer should verify whether the auditor has inquired the management, internal audit team, and those charged with the governance of any instances of actual or alleged fraud that has occurred in the past and attend their respective views on the risk of the fraud. So it is a duty of the reviewer. They have to inquire with the management, is there any fraud, whether there is any actual fraud, or whether there is any alleged fraud that has taken place in the past. And the reviewer, once again, they have to consult the internal audit team, and the person who's in charge of the practicing unit should also be verified and inquired by the reviewer about the fraud. Then the reviewer should verify whether the auditor has identified any unusual or unexpected relationship while performing analytical procedures, and whether he has evaluated them to assess the risk of material misstatement due to fraud. So risk, that is, if there is any misstatement, that is material misstatement of financial statement which leads to fraud, that does also to be verified by the reviewer. And if there is any unusual or unexpected relationship is there, that may also lead to fraud. So everything has to be reviewed by the reviewer. So the duty of the reviewer is not only to verify the accounts and verify the accounts of the practicing unit, but he has to verify whether the practicing unit has identified the fraud or not. The reviewer should verify whether the auditor has investigated any inconsistent responses from the management related to the inquiries. So he has to verify, it is a duty of the reviewer. The reviewer has to verify whether the auditor has investigated the fraud related inquiries. So this is what we have to see from SA 240. Now SA 250, that is constitution of laws and regulations in audit of financial statements. That is, the reviewer should verify whether the auditor has requested the management and where appropriate, those charged with governance to provide written representation that all known instances of non-compliance or suspected non-compliance with the laws and regulations and whose effects should be considered when preparing the financial statements have been disclosed to the auditor. So whether the laws and regulations have been properly followed by the practicing unit at the time of audit. And if there is any non-compliance of laws and regulations while preparing the financial statements, it has to be identified by the reviewer, and it is a duty of the reviewer to verify whether laws and regulations have been properly complied at the time of preparation of the financial statements. This has been clearly stated in SA 250. Now, SA 260 is a communication with those charged with the governance. That is those charged with governance. That's the person who is in charge. So the reviewer should verify whether significant findings from the audit have been communicated to those charged with the governance. Suppose if any person who is in charge of the governance, there is in charge of person, he has to be communicated with all the information about the significant findings, whether there is any fraud, or whether there is any change in method of accounting, or if there is any accounting problem, or if there is any staff problem, or if there is any material problem, material defects in the preparation of the financial statements. Everything have to be communicated to the persons in charge of the governance. The reviewer should verify whether the form, timing, and expected general content of the communications have been communicated to those charged with the governance. So that means the form, timing, and expected general consent, everything have to be communicated to the person in charge. Next one is SA 265, that is communicating deficiencies in internal control to those charged with the governance and management. The reviewer should verify whether the significant deficiencies in internal management identified during the audit have been communicated in writing to those charged with the governance on a timely basis. So here they are talking about in SA 265, it is talking about the internal control, and if there is any deficiencies in internal control, and those have to be identified during the audit, and those things have to be communicated to the person who are in charge for the audit, and it has to be done on timely basis. This is with reference to SA 265. Next one is SA 300, that is planning an audit of financial statements. Now, how to plan to do the audit of financial statements? The reviewer should verify whether the auditor has established an overall audit strategy that sets the scope, timing, and direction of the audit and guides the development of the audit plan. So it is clearly stated that you have to establish an overall audit strategy and you have to develop an audit plan. And what is the scope of the audit? What is the timing of the audit? How to do what are the directions that the audit has to take place during the verification of audit, financial statements? Whether the person in charge, whether the practicing unit has established this kind of overall audit strategy. Then the reviewer should verify whether the auditor has planned the nature, timing, and extent the direct supervision of engagement team and members and reviewer. So here the overall audit strategy has to be carried out, and the auditor has to plan all the work of the staff, that is nature of work, timing of work, and extent and direction and supervision of the engagement team, whether the practicing unit has got the proper plan or not, that has also to be reviewed or verified by the reviewer. Then the reviewer needs to verify whether the auditor has documented. So documentation is very, very important. That is overall audit strategy, audit plan. Then if there is any significant change made during the audit engagement to the overall audit strategy or the audit plan, and the reasons for such changes. So everything has to be properly documented by the practicing unit. So SA 315, that is identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatement through understanding the entity and its environment. The reviewer needs to verify whether the auditor has obtained an understanding of. So that means the auditor should understand what, and whether it is duty of the reviewer to see whether the auditor has obtained the understanding of relevant industry. That is, the auditor should know what are the rules and regulations, what are the procedures of relevant industry, regulatory authorities, and other external factors, including applicable financial reporting framework. So whether the auditor has understand this, so that has also to be reviewed by the reviewer. And nature of the entity, including its operations, ownership, and governance structures, types of investments that is the entity is making, and the way that the entity is structured and how it is financed. So it is nothing but financial structure, whether the same is being properly done by the unit or not, by the client or not. So the auditor should have got the understanding. Without understanding this, it cannot possible for the auditor to do the audit. So what is the entity's objectives and strategies and those related to business risk that may result in risk of material, that is material mismanagement, the measurement review of the entity's financial performance. So the auditor must understand about the entity. He must understand the objective. What is the matters that are applicable for that team? What are the factors that are applicable for the industry? What are the regulatory rules and regulations of that are applicable for the industry? What about the finance? That is, everything has to be properly understood by the auditor. Then only it is possible for him to do the audit. Whether the auditor understands this, and it has to be, it is a duty of the reviewer has to verify all those types of understanding. Now we are going for SA 320, that is materiality in planning and performing the audit. The reviewer shall verify whether the auditor has determined materiality and performance materiality when planning the audit. So that means it is nothing but indirectly or directly they are saying that the auditor should carry out the audit on materiality concept. So if the matter is not material, then he will not plan. And he just like that, he can do the audit. But if it is the audit, if the work is material, then the auditor has to plan that work. The reviewer shall verify whether the auditor has documented. So again, so planning. Again, it has to be documented for what? Materiality for the financial statements as a whole. If applicable, the materiality level or the levels of a particular class of transactions upon balances or discloses performance materiality. That is, the auditor has to plan and determine to do work, and only for the materiality concept. If there is any deficiency in the materiality concept, then that has to be found out, that has to be carried out properly by the practice unit, and it is a duty of the reviewer to see whether the auditor has got the determined materiality, that is, has followed the materiality concept in a legal manner. Next one is SA 330. That is auditors responses to assessed risk. The reviewer shall verify whether the auditor has designed and performed further audit procedures whose nature, timing, and extent are based on and are responsive to the assessed risk material mismanagement at the assessment level. So whether the audit is there is any misstatement in the materiality concept, then the same thing has to be verified, has to be found by the auditor, and it is duty of the reviewer to verify whether the auditor has got the designed and performed a further audit procedure. So the audit procedure should also to be verified by the reviewer. Then the reviewer shall verify whether the auditor has designed and performed a test of control to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence as to the operating effectiveness of relevant controls. So to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So the auditor must obtain the audit evidence before coming to any conclusion. The reviewer has to verify whether the auditor has obtained the sufficient appropriate evidence or not. This is with reference to SA 330. Now, the reviewer in SA 330, they say that the reviewer shall verify whether the auditor has documented. So documentation is very, very important. That is, overall responses to address the assessed risk of material mismanagement at the financial statement level and the nature, timing, and extent of the further audit procedures performed, then linkage of those procedures with the assessed risk at the assertion level, results of the audit procedures, including conclusions where these are not otherwise clear. SA 450. That is evaluation of misstatements identified during the audit. Slowly they are giving the materiality, then misstatement. So the reviewer, it is a duty of the reviewer, he shall review whether the auditor has accumulated misstatements identified during the audit other than those that are clearly trivial. So the auditors, they have to accumulate all the misstatements and they have to take decision before coming to any conclusion. The reviewer shall review whether the auditor has communicated on the timely basis all the misstatements accumulated during the audit with appropriate levels of management unless prohibited by the laws, unless prohibited by law or regulation. So the auditor has to accumulate the mismanagement, and that has to be, all the misstatements have to be communicated to the client on a timely basis. And if the communication is barred or prohibited by law or regulation, those things have not be or should not be communicated to the clients. So the reviewer shall verify whether the auditor has documented the following. That is, he has to verify and he has to see whether the auditor has documented the amount below which the misstatement will be regarded as clearly trivial, and a misstatement accumulated during the audit, whether they have been corrected. Everything has to be properly documented. Then the auditor's conclusion as to whether uncorrected misstatements are material. Suppose all the misstatements are material, and if there is any uncorrected misstatements that are material, individual or in aggregate, and the basis for that conclusion. Suppose if the auditor say that it is not material, the misstatement is not material, and they have to record everything, and it is a duty of the reviewer to see whether the auditor's conclusion is correct or not. This is with reference to SA 450. SA 500, that is audit evidence. The reviewer should review whether the auditor has obtained sufficient and appropriate audit evidence while performing his audit. So once again, the SA 500 say that it is duty of the auditor to obtain the audit evidence, appropriate audit evidence. And the reviewer should verify the sample selected by the auditor for testing the sufficiency and appropriateness of the audit evidence. The thing is, first, the audit evidence has to be collected by the auditor, and the sample has to be selected by the auditor to do the audit. The reviewer has to verify whether the sample chosen by the auditor is correct or not, to verify the sufficiency and the appropriateness of the audit evidence. This is with reference to SA 500. And SA 501, audit evidence, specific consideration for the selected items. The reviewer should verify whether the auditor has obtained sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. So that means that is indirectly or directly they are saying that the auditor must obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence with reference to the existence and conditions of inventory, completeness of litigation and claims involving the entity. So the stock verification, stock existence, stock quality, everything has to be properly evidenced to the auditor by the client. And if there is any legal litigation at the unit, and if there is any claim is there by the unit or against the unit, then everything has to be properly verified by the auditor, and it is duty of the reviewer to verify whether these have been verified by the auditor or not. So presentation and disclosure of segment information in accordance with applicable financial reporting framework. Next one is SA 505, external communication. Now comes to the communication. The reviewer should verify whether external communication are sought as an audit evidence. So whether during the audit evidence reliance, whether external communications have been taken as the base for the audit evidence. Then the reviewer should identify whether the auditor has obtained further audit evidence to resolve the doubts about the reliability of the response to a confirmation request. So the reviewer can, and that is whether the reviewer can see whether the auditor has obtained any additional information other than the external confirmation. So in order to support, in order to rely on the external communication, then the reviewer should identify whether the auditor has performed the alternative audit procedures to obtain relevant and reliable audit evidence in case of non-response to such confirmation request. So first thing, external communication can be sought and can be relied as audit evidence. The auditor may call for another audit evidence. For further details, they can call. And if the further details have not been obtained by the auditor, whether the auditor has performed the alternative audit procedures to get the information or not. Everything has to be reviewed by the reviewer. That is SA 505. Now SA 510, initial audit engagements. That is opening balances. It is indirectly they say that you have to verify the opening balances of the account. That means you have to go to the last year's balance sheet and you have to verify the opening balance, that is closing balance. The reviewer should verify whether the last year's audited financial statement and audit report are obtained by the auditor for verification of the opening balance. That is, it is clearly stated that that is all the closing balance of the earlier year, all the things have been brought as the opening balance. So it is again, it is a duty of the auditor, and the reviewer has to see whether the auditor has verified last year's statement to verify the opening balance. So it is the duty of the reviewer. Then the reviewer should verify whether the materiality of the opening balance related to the financial statements for the current period have been identified by the auditor. So they section SA 510, they say that it is not only the verification of opening balance, is there any materiality concept that is there in the opening balance? Suppose if any outstanding balance or any tax arrears, anything that is stated in the last year where everything has been properly brought on this in this year have to be verified by the auditor. And again, it is a duty of the reviewer to see whether the auditor has verified the opening balance or not. That is SA 510. SA 520, analytical procedure. That the reviewer should identify whether the auditor has determined the suitability of the particular substantive analytical procedures for given assertions, taking into account of the assessed risks for the material misstatement and test of details, if any, for these assertions. The reviewer should identify whether the auditor has evaluated the reliability of data. So reliability of the data is also to be evaluated by the auditor. And again, the reviewer has to see whether the auditor has evaluated the reliability of the data from which the auditor's expectation of the recorded amounts or ratios is developed, taking into account the source, comparability, and nature and relevance of information available and controls over preparation. So all this that at the time of preparation of the data, the auditor has to evaluate the reliability, whether the source, whether he has obtained the source to prepare the data is correct or not, whether the auditor can rely on that data or not, then comparability and nature of relevance of information. So everything has to be taken care of by the auditor. It is a very, very simple. All these are the duties of the auditor, and the reviewer has to see whether the auditor has evaluated the reliability of the data properly or not. Then the reviewer should identify whether the auditor has developed an expectation of recorded amounts or ratios and evaluated whether the expectation is sufficiently precise to identify misstatement that individually or when aggregated with other misstatements may cause financial statements to be materially misstated. Then the reviewer should verify whether the amount of any difference of recorded events from the expected values that is acceptable has been determined by the auditor. Suppose there is a budget, we can say budget and actual amount. If there is any difference, whether the same has been relied and why there is a difference, everything has to be analyzed by the auditor. And it is a duty of the reviewer to see whether the auditor has analyzed those difference or not. That is with reference to SA 520. SA 530, that is audit sampling. The audit reviewer should verify whether the auditor has considered the purpose of the audit procedure and the characteristics of the population while designing the audit sample. So one thing is audit sample has to be selected, and whether the auditor has considered the purpose of for what they are doing the audit, everything has to be considered by the auditor, and whether the same have been considered by the auditor, this has to be reviewed, verified by the reviewer. Then the reviewer should identify whether the sample size selected by the auditor is sufficient. One thing is, first they have to select the sample, and the auditor, the choosing of the sample, whether the same thing is sufficient or not, that has to be identified by the reviewer, and reviewer should verify whether the auditor has selected the item for sample in which in a way that each sampling unit in the population has a chance of selection. So sample has to be selected by the auditor, and whether that is sufficient or not, and that sample should represent the entire business or entire client's business. Whether the auditor has done the same thing or correctly or not, that has to be reviewed or verified by the reviewer. That is with reference to SA 530. SA 540, that is auditing accounting estimates, including fair value accounting estimates and related disclosures. That is, the reviewer should verify whether the auditor has made inquiries of management about the changes in the circumstances that may give rise to new or the need to revise existing and accounting estimates. The reviewer should identify whether the auditor has obtained an understanding of how the management makes accounting estimates and an understanding of the data on which they are based. The reviewer should verify whether the auditor has reviewed the outcome of the accounting estimates included in the prior period financial statements, or where applicable, their subsequent estimation for the purpose of current period. So he has to, yes, first thing, whatever the management expected changes, that he has to verify, that is auditor has to verify. And there is, what about the management estimates, that is also to be verified by the auditor, that is has to be seen by the auditor. Then whether the outcome, that is outcome of the auditing accounting estimates are correct or not, and it has to be done with the prior period happening, and whether the same is being considered for this year working also. Everything has to be considered by the auditors, and the reviewer has to verify all those auditors work with reference to the management, with reference to managing of accounting estimates. SA 550, that is related parties. The reviewer should verify whether the auditor has made inquiries of management, that is with the reference to related parties, whether the auditor has made the inquiries, that is identity of the entity of the related parties, including changes from the prior period, the nature of relationship between the entity and these related parties, whether the entity entered into any transaction with these related parties during the period, and if so, the type and purpose of transaction. That is nothing but the transaction that has taken place between the related parties and the client has to be verified by the auditor, and has to be seen by the auditor, and the auditor has to exercise all care. Is that if the transaction with the related parties affect the client or not. And the reviewer has to verify whether the auditor has considered the happenings of the related party transactions. Then the reviewer should verify whether the auditor has identified and reviewed the related party transactions to ensure that those are in accordance with the applicable financial reporting. Yes, this is clear that auditor should verify all the financial transactions that the client had with the related parties, whether it affects the business or not, whether it gives importance to the business or not, whether it improves the business or not. And it is duty of the reviewer to see whether the auditor has considered all the related party transactions as stated in SA 550, that is standards on auditing. Then SA 560, subsequent events, that is a balance sheet. After that, if any events happen, that is called as subsequent events. Then the reviewer should verify whether the auditor has obtained understanding of any procedures the management has established to ensure that the subsequent events are identified. Suppose if there is any subsequent event, whether the same has been given credit for the year of audit, whether what is the importance that the management has taken, has given for understanding the events that is occurring after the date of balance sheet. The reviewer should verify whether the auditor has inquired the management and where appropriate those in charge with the governance as to whether any subsequent events have occurred which may affect the financial statements. Suppose if there is any happening that has taken after the balance sheet date, whether that affects the original balance sheet. Let us take from the NPA angle also. At the time of 31/3/2022, that account is NPA, but during the month of April, if the party has paid the amount fully or closed the account, then that is a materiality nature, because the balance sheet of 31/3/22 shows there's a defect in the payment or irregular payment in the banking, but that has been regularized or paid by the party after the date of balance sheet. So whether the auditor at the time of verification of the accounts, whether they have considered the events occurring after the date of balance sheet, whether that is material in nature, that has to be verified by the auditor, and whether the same has been verified by the auditor, it has to be seen or confirmed by the reviewer. The reviewer needs to verify whether the minutes of the meeting which have been held after the date of financial statements have been obtained by the auditor, and whether the auditor has inquired about the matters discussed at any such meeting for which the minutes were not available or not yet available. So it is very, very simple that to consider the events occurring after the balance sheet day, a proper minute should be there. Whether the auditor has considered that minutes of the meeting or not, that has to be reviewed by the reviewer. The reviewer needs to verify whether entities latest or subsequent interim financial statements have been obtained by the auditor. That means there is an interim financial statement, and whether the same thing has been obtained by the auditor before taking any decision or not, then the reviewer has to verify whether the auditor has obtained the interim financial statements or not. This is with reference to SA 560. SA 570, that is going concern. The reviewer should identify whether the auditor is alert throughout the audit for the audit evidence and the events or conditions that may cast significant doubt on the entity's ability to continue as a going concern. So it is a duty of the auditor to see whether the concern is a going concern or not. The reviewer should identify whether the auditor has evaluated the management's assessment of the entity's ability to continue as a going concern. This is with reference to SA 570. SA 580, written representation. If anything is being asked by the auditor, then the client has to be given everything in writing and the client has to give everything in writing to the auditor, whether the same has been obtained by the auditor and this has to be verified by the reviewer. So the reviewer should verify whether the auditor has obtained written representation from the management and where appropriate, those charged with the governance that they believe that they have fulfilled the responsibility for the preparation of financial statements and for the completeness of the information provided by the auditor. This is with reference to SA 580. So written representation from the auditor to the client, from the client to the auditor, whether the same has been obtained by the auditor and everything has to be reviewed by the reviewer. Has to be verified by the reviewer. SA 610, that is using the work of internal auditors. So it is clear indication that the auditor must use the services of the internal auditor, but to what extent they have relied, everything has to be clearly documented, has to be clearly mentioned by the auditor, and the same thing has to be verified by the reviewer. So the reviewer should verify if the external auditor has determined whether the work of the internal auditor is likely to be adequate. So whether the internal auditor work is adequate or not, that has to be determined by the external auditor for the purpose of audit and the planned effect of the work of the internal auditors on the nature and timing or extent of the external auditor procedures. Then the reviewer needs to identify whether the external auditor has evaluated objectivity, that is evaluation from the external auditor is a must one for the objectivity of the internal audit function, for what purpose they have carried out the internal audit and what are the technical competence of the internal auditor. So they say that the external auditor has to even verify the technical competence of the internal auditor. If the internal auditor is appointed just like that, that will not be enough and that will not be considered. XAS 700. That is forming an opinion and reporting of financial statement. The reviewer should verify whether the financial statements are prepared in all material respects. So it is a clear indication that a financial statement must be prepared based on the material concept and accordance with the requirements of the applicable financial reporting framework. Point number 2, the reviewer shall verify whether all the contents of the report are included in the auditor. So whether everything is being included in the auditor's report, because you are doing the audit based on the financial statements of material nature and what are the findings, everything has to be covered in the auditor's report. Then the reviewer shall verify whether the key audit matters are communicated in the auditor's report in accordance with the SA 701 in case of audits of complete sets of general purpose financial statements of the listed entities. Now, SA 705, modification out to the opinion to the independent auditors. Suppose if any modification is required or if any reports have been modified by the auditor, that has to be done properly and that has to be verified by the reviewer also. So the reviewer shall verify whether the auditor has modified the opinion in the auditor's report. If he concludes that based on the audited evidence obtained, the financial statements as a whole are not free from material misstatement. That is one thing. And second thing is unable to obtain sufficient or appropriate audit evidence to conclude that the financial statements as a whole are free from material mismanagement. So this is with reference to SA 705. So if there is any modification in the audit report, whether if the modification is due to the reason that they are not able to obtain any information. So SA 706 emphasizes the matter paragraphs and other matter paragraphs in the independent auditor's report. That is, reviewer shall check whether the auditor has communicated with those charged with the governance regarding the expected to include emphasis of the matter paragraph and the wordings of this paragraph. So that is with reference to SA 706. SA 710, comparative information, corresponding figures and comparative financial statements. The reviewer shall review if the auditor has evaluated whether the comparative information agrees with the amounts and other disclosures presented in the prior period. So that means prior period item he has to take, current year period he has to take, they have to make the comparison. So whether the auditor has evaluated that thing, that has to be reviewed by the reviewer. Then reviewer shall review if the auditor has evaluated whether the accounting policies reflected in the comparative information are consistent with those applied in the current period, or if there have been changes in the accounting policies, whether those have been properly accounted for and adequately presented and disclosed. It is very, very simple whether the unit has got the consistent accounting policy, whether the same has been verified by the auditor and the same has to be reviewed by the reviewer. That is SA 710. SA 720, auditor's responsibility in relation to other information in documents containing audited financial statement. That is, the reviewer shall review if the auditor has made appropriate arrangements with the management or those with the charged with the governance to obtain other information. Suppose the auditor wants any other information, whether the same has been communicated to the management, whether they made some other arrangement to get all the other information and prior to the date of the auditor's. Then the reviewer shall identify whether the auditor has determined any material inconsistency in relation to such other information and check whether the audited financial statements or other information needs to be revised. So whether if there is any material inconsistency, whether the auditor has given importance and whether the same thing has been given effect in the financial statements with a revision. So this has to be taken care of by the auditor, and the reviewer has to see whether is there any material inconsistency, whether the same has been considered by the auditor or not. That is SA 800. That is special considerations audit of financial statements prepared in accordance with the special purpose frameworks. That is, a reviewer shall identify whether the auditor has obtained the following. That is, the auditor has obtained an understanding of the following. That is, the auditor must understand this. That is the purpose for which the financial statements are prepared. Who is going to use it? That is intended users. The steps taken by the management to determine that are applicable financial reporting is acceptable in the circumstances. So any auditor, he cannot analyze financial statements just like that. So he has to see whether the purpose of the financial statements is achieved and who is going to use it. Everything has to be identified by the auditor, and the reviewer has to verify whether the auditor has got the understanding of those things. Then SA 805, that is audit of single financial statements and specific elements accounting or items of financial statement. The reviewer shall review whether the auditor has complied with all the standards on auditing relevant to the audit. So that means in general, they say the 805, they say that if there is anything omitted, everything is being covered in SA 805, whether the auditor has considered all the standards on auditing. And SA 810, that is engagement to report of summary financial statement. The reviewer shall review whether before accepting an engagement to report on summary financial statements, and the auditor has determined whether the applied criteria are acceptable and obtained agreement of management that it acknowledges and understands its responsibilities, agreed with the management in the form of opinion to be expressed on the summary of financial statement. That means everything has to be discussed with the management, and everything the auditors say that yes, everything has been accepted by the management. And the reviewer shall review if the auditor has evaluated whether the summary of financial statements adequately disclose the summarized nature and identify the audited financial statements. So whether the auditor evaluation is correct or not, that has to be reviewed by the reviewer. The reviewer shall review whether the summary of financial statements obtained by the auditor adequately disclose the applied rate. So first thing is very, very simple. You have to obtain the financial statements. What is the materiality concept based on which that financial statements have been obtained, and whether everything is being properly communicated to the person in charge, whether the same thing is also being communicated to the team, and whether they have carried out the audit as per the plan, whether the plan has got the materiality plan, everything is being taken care of by the standards on accounting. What are the important things that the peer review board has stated with reference to standards on auditing with a particular reference to the peer review? I have discussed here, and now I am concluding the discussion on standards on auditing. And thank you very much for the patient hearing. And it is an ocean. essay is standards on auditing is ocean. Please go through the class carefully. Every class, CLA, USC, every class is very, very important. And I wish you all the best for your profession and for your peer review work. Nandri, Vanakkam.